The sirens didn't sound urgent at first. They never do, not until they're outside your house, bouncing red and blue off your windows like an accusation. I remember standing in my kitchen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, watching those lights smear across the wall and thinking, this can't possibly be for me. It was. 2 police officers stepped out of the cruiser, hands resting casually near their belts, eyes already scanning my driveway as if they expected to find a meth lab instead of a slightly dented Toyota and an overwatered lawn. Behind them, across the street, Mrs. Calder from the HOA stood on her porch in a silk robe, arms crossed, watching with a kind of satisfaction usually reserved for courtroom dramas and public hangings. That's when I knew the Homeowners Association had made a very, very expensive mistake. The knock came hard, authoritative, practiced. I opened the door before they could knock again, heart pounding not with fear, but disbelief. One officer asked my name. The other glanced past me, eyes catching on a stack of HOA violation letters on the entryway table. Unmowed grass. Trash bins visible for more than 12 hours. An unapproved solar panel inverter I'd installed 6 months earlier. They told me they received a report of suspicious activity and a possible threat to community safety. I laughed. Actually laughed. Out loud. That laugh was the moment everything tipped. Because when you laugh at the wrong time in front of the wrong people, you stop being a nuisance and start being a problem. And problems invite scrutiny. What the HOA didn't know, what Mrs. Calder definitely didn't know as she watched from behind her curtains, was that I had spent the last 15 years designing compliance systems for municipal governments. I knew bylaws the way surgeons know anatomy. I knew where the nerves were, where the arteries ran, and exactly what happened when you apply pressure in the wrong place. Calling the cops wasn't just petty. It was a declaration of war. And by the end of one meeting, I wouldn't just win. I would own the entire system. The officers were polite, to their credit. They always are at first. I answered their questions calmly, invited them inside, and watched as their suspicions slowly deflated into mild embarrassment. There was no crime, no threat, no violation beyond the usual HOA nonsense that somehow kept retired people alive and thriving. One officer stepped outside to make a call. The other lingered, lowering his voice. You know this was a civil matter, right? Oh, I know, I said. They know too. He nodded, eyes flicking toward Mrs. Calder's house. You might want to file a complaint. I will, I said, and I meant it, just not the way he thought. By the time the cruisers pulled away, the street had returned to its usual quiet. Birds chirped. Sprinklers hissed. Mrs. Calder retreated indoors, undoubtedly drafting her next email to the board about my attitude. I stood on my porch long after the lights disappeared, something cold and precise settling into place behind my ribs. I wasn't angry. Anger is sloppy. I was focused. Because here's the thing about HOAs no one tells you until it's too late. They only have power because most people don't read the documents. They don't read the bylaws, the covenants, the amendments, the footnotes that contradict the footnotes. They don't attend meetings. They don't volunteer. They don't ask questions. I did. That night, I pulled out the thick binder I'd kept since moving in, the one I'd been quietly annotating for years. Tabs, highlights, margin notes, cross-references to state statutes and case law. I'd always treated it like a hobby, a mental exercise, a way to stay sharp. Now it was a weapon. I flipped to the section on emergency authority, then board conduct and liability, then improper use of law enforcement. My pen moved quickly, circling phrases, drawing arrows, underlining sentences that suddenly glowed with possibility. By the time I went to bed, I had a plan. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Open forum. Public comments allowed. 3 minutes per homeowner. Most people use those 3 minutes to complain about parking or mailbox colors. I was going to use mine to change everything. Over the next few days, word spread about the police visit. It always does. Neighbors stopped me during evening walks, lowering their voices, asking what really happened. I smiled, shrugged, told them the truth in the most boring way possible. It was a misunderstanding, I said, but it raised some concerns. Concerns are contagious. By Wednesday, I had a small but curious audience. Thursday night, the community center was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner. The board sat at their long table, nameplates polished, expressions rehearsed. Mrs. Calder avoided my eyes. When my name was called, I stood up with a single folder in my hand. No shouting, no threats, no theatrics, just facts. I began with the police report number, then the bylaw citations, then the state statute that made misuse of emergency services a personal liability issue for board members, not the HOA, them. Individually, you could hear the air leave the room. I watched their faces change as understanding crept in. This wasn't a complaint. This wasn't a tantrum. This was an audit. And I was just getting started. Because what none of them realized yet, what would become painfully clear by the end of that meeting, was that in trying to intimidate me, they had handed me standing, leverage, and an open door straight into the machinery of power. And once you're inside the system, you don't have to fight it. You just have to turn the right knobs. The room didn't erupt into chaos after I finished speaking. That surprised everyone, including me. Instead, it went quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting. The kind of silence where people stop fidgeting and start calculating. The HOA president, Mark Delaney, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He was a former middle manager who spoke in bullet points and believed authority came from laminated badges and Robert's Rules of Order. His confidence had carried him for years. Tonight, it abandoned him. "Thank you for your comments," he said carefully. "The board will take them under advisement." That was the phrase they always used. It usually worked. People sat down, frustrated but defeated, and life went on. I didn't sit. With respect, I said, "Still calm, that's not sufficient." A ripple went through the crowd. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. Delaney frowned. "So, public comment." "Is not what this is," I interrupted gently. "This is notice." I lifted the folder. Formal notice. Now he was sweating. I could see it beading along his hairline under the fluorescent lights. HOA boards are used to being challenged emotionally. They are not used to being challenged procedurally. I turned slightly so the room could hear me, not just the board. That was deliberate. Power hates witnesses. Last Saturday, at 9:42 a.m., 2 officers from the City Police Department were dispatched to my residence following a call made by a member of this board, alleging suspicious activity and a potential threat to public safety. I paused. That allegation was false. Mrs. Calder stiffened. "Under Section 8.14 of our bylaws," I continued, "the board is explicitly prohibited from engaging emergency services for enforcement of covenant violations except in cases of immediate danger." I flipped the page. State law further clarifies that knowingly false reports to law enforcement expose the reporting party to civil liability. Murmurs, this time louder. Delaney leaned forward. "Are you accusing this board of criminal behavior?" "No," I said. "I'm documenting exposure." That landed. One of the other board members, a woman named Denise who had spent most meetings scrolling on her phone, finally looked up. "What exactly do you want?" There it was. The most important question in any negotiation. "I want 3 things," I said. "Transparency, corrective action, and compliance." I held up one finger. "First, I want the minutes from the last 12 executive sessions released to the community, as required when legal matters affect homeowners." Gasps. Executive sessions were the board's favorite hiding place. Second finger. Second, I want a written acknowledgement that law enforcement will not be used for HOA enforcement absent true emergencies. Third finger. Third, I want the formation of an independent compliance review committee. Delaney blinked. "Independent?" "Yes," I said, "which I am volunteering to chair." The room exploded. Not shouting. Worse. Overlapping whispers, incredulous laughter, someone openly saying, "No way." Denise leaned toward Delaney, whispering furiously. Mrs. Calder stood up halfway, then sat back down, her face flush red. Delaney banged the gavel. "Order." I waited. Let them burn energy. Let them realize something had changed. "You can't just appoint yourself," he said once things quieted. "That's not how this works." I smiled. Not smug. Almost apologetic. Actually, I said, "It is." I read aloud the bylaw clause that allowed any homeowner to petition for the creation of a special committee if 10% of residents supported it. Then I gestured casually to the back of the room. 10 people stood up, then 15, then nearly a third of the room. I hadn't coordinated it. I hadn't needed to. Fear does the organizing for you. Everyone there had imagined police lights outside their own house over something trivial. Everyone had their own story of harassment, fines, warning letters. This was no longer about me. Delaney's voice cracked. We'll need to verify signatures." "You can," I said. "They are already submitted." I placed a stack of papers on the table. Names, addresses, lot numbers, neatly organized. I watched the realization sink in. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a threat. This was governance. The board recessed for 20 minutes. The longest 20 minutes of their lives. The room buzzed like a hive. People came up to me, neighbors I'd barely spoken to in years, thanking me, telling me stories, asking what would happen next. "Change," I said, "if you let it." When the board returned, Delaney's shoulders were slumped. Denise wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Mrs. Calder was gone. "We will," Delaney said slowly, "acknowledge receipt of the petition. Progress. And," he added, clearly choosing his words with care, "we will suspend any enforcement actions pending review." That was bigger than he realized. The vote to create the committee passed. Unanimously. They had no choice. Opposing it would be on record. And just like that, I had a title. Chair of the Compliance Review Committee. It sounded boring. It was anything but. Over the next 2 weeks, my inbox filled faster than I could respond. Emails, handwritten letters, even a few anonymous notes slipped under my door. People wanted me to look at fines, liens, denied architectural requests, selective enforcement. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain homeowners were targeted repeatedly. Others, friends of board members, were mysteriously untouched. Rules were enforced inconsistently, often retroactively. Vendors were chosen without competitive bids. None of it was illegal enough to make headlines. All of it was illegal enough to matter. I requested documents. They resisted. I cited bylaws. They delayed. I cited statutes. They complied. Every request widened the crack. The turning point came when I found the insurance policy, buried in an appendix, a clause excluding coverage for intentional acts, including misuse of authority. I called a special meeting. "This is informational," I told the board, "not accusatory." They didn't believe me. They shouldn't have. I explained, calmly, what personal liability meant, what discovery meant, what depositions meant, what happens when emails get subpoenaed. Denise started crying. Delaney asked for a recess. When they came back, they asked me what I wanted. This time, I didn't give them a list. I gave them an option. Resign, restructure, and let the community elect new leadership under revised procedures. I'll face a process I could no longer control. They asked for the weekend. By Monday morning, 3 board members had resigned, including Delaney. The HOA didn't collapse. It transformed. Interim leadership was appointed. Elections were scheduled. Policies were frozen pending review. And me? I didn't take a board seat. I didn't need to. Because once you understand the system, once you know where the pressure points are, you don't have to sit at the table to control the room. You just have to know when to speak, and when to let silence do the rest. Power doesn't disappear when people resign. It panics. The Monday after the board stepped down, the HOA office opened late. The manager called in sick. The voicemail greeting was changed twice in one day, each version more strained than the last. Emails went unanswered, then came back in clumps, short, defensive, carefully worded. That was my first clue. Organizations in trouble don't collapse outward. They collapse inward. Meetings multiply. Committees form. Lawyers get seasick on emails that don't need them. Everyone starts documenting everything, not to improve the system, but to survive it. And survival leaves fingerprints. The interim board asked me, very politely, if I would limit communications to scheduled updates. That's bureaucratic for please stop digging. I responded with a single sentence. As chair, I'm obligated to complete the review. No emotion, no threat, just obligation. The insurance carrier responded 2 days later. Not to me, to the HOA. They wanted clarification on recent governance changes and potential exposure events. They requested minutes, reports, and documentation of corrective actions. The interim board forwarded the email to me with a note that said, FYI. That was the second clue. Insurance companies don't ask questions unless they already know the answers or are about to find them. Someone had talked. Maybe the city, maybe the police department, maybe the former board's own attorney, quietly protecting themselves. Either way, the system had noticed. I scheduled interviews. Not interrogations, interviews. Voluntary, confidential, recorded with consent. I framed them as opportunities to provide context. People love context when it lets them tell their side. The first was the HOA manager, Linda. She'd been there 8 years, knew everything, controlled the paperwork. She sat stiffly across from me in the conference room, hands wrapped around a paper cup of water. I just followed instructions, she said before I even asked a question. I know, I said, and I meant it. I didn't ask her about the police call. I asked her about enforcement workflows, who flagged violations, how letters were generated, who approved fines. Her answers contradicted the written procedures. Not dramatically, subtly, enough to matter. Then I asked about exceptions. She hesitated, looked at the door, lowered her voice. Sometimes the board would handle things directly. Directly how? Calls, emails, notes slipped under my door. I nodded, took notes, didn't react. Next came vendors, the landscaping company, the security patrol, the consultant who billed hourly to interpret rules that were already clear. Every conversation added another thread, none of them damning alone. Together, a web, and webs are fragile. Word got out that I was thorough, that I listened, that I didn't yell. That made people bold. A homeowner named Carla sent me a spreadsheet. He was an accountant, had tracked fines over 5 years. The numbers were interesting. Another neighbor forwarded an email chain from 2 years ago, an executive session discussion about setting an example by aggressively enforcing against a specific house. That house had been sold at a loss 6 months later. Patterns became timelines. Timelines became narratives. I compiled everything into a report. Not a manifesto, not a rant, a report. Footnotes, citations, appendices, neutral language. No adjectives that could be called emotional. No accusations, just findings. When I delivered it to the interim board, they didn't read it in the room. They skimmed, their faces drained of color. This is extensive, one of them said. It's complete, I replied. They asked if they could have their attorney review it. Of course, I said. I've already shared it with the insurance carrier. That was the moment the system turned on itself. The attorney advised limited disclosure. The insurer demanded full disclosure. The interim board was stuck in the middle, afraid to move, afraid not to. Residents noticed. Attendance at meetings doubled, then tripled. People brought copies of the report. Highlighted sections. Questions multiplied. Why was my fine enforced when this one wasn't? Why did this vendor get renewed without bids? Who authorized this? The interim board did their best. They really did. But they were caretakers, not leaders. They had inherited a mess with a ticking clock, and the clock was loud. Then the letter came. Certified mail, heavy paper, legal phrasing. The insurance carrier was reserving rights. That's industry language for we might not cover this. Panic is contagious. The former board members started emailing me directly, carefully, politely, some apologetic, some defensive. One asked if we could meet informally. I declined, in writing, with witnesses. Another asked if I would consider reframing certain findings. I asked which ones were incorrect. They stopped responding. The city sent a notice requesting documentation related to HOA use of law enforcement. The police department wanted clarification on future calls. I drafted a policy. Clear, narrow, compliant. It was adopted unanimously. That policy alone shifted the balance of power. The HOA could no longer escalate minor issues through fear. People felt it. Fines dropped. Letters stopped. The tone changed. But systems don't give up without a last move. A special election was scheduled. New board candidates emerged. Some reform-minded. Some very clearly backed by former leadership. One of them ran on a platform of restoring order. I attended the candidate forum. Sat in the back. Listened. When it was time for questions, I raised my hand. I asked one question. Do you believe the HOA has ever misused its authority? The room went quiet. One candidate dodged. Another blamed misunderstandings. The third, backed by old guard money, said, no system is perfect, but enforcement is necessary. I nodded. Then I followed up. Would you commit to maintaining the Compliance Review Committee as a permanent, independent body? He hesitated. That hesitation cost him the election. The new board was different. Younger, more cautious, more aware. They didn't ask me to join. They asked me to advise. I agreed, with conditions. The committee became permanent. Reporting requirements were codified. Executive sessions were limited. Enforcement guidelines were standardized. The HOA didn't become perfect. It became accountable. And accountability is the one thing power fears more than opposition. One evening, weeks later, I ran into Mrs. Calder at the grocery store. She avoided my eyes at first, then sighed. I didn't think it would go this far, she said. Neither did I replied. That wasn't a lie. She nodded, resigned. I just wanted you to follow the rules. I did, I said. Better than anyone. She walked away without another word. That's when I understood something important. I hadn't taken control by force. I'd taken it by letting the system apply its own rules to itself. And once a system learns it can be held accountable, it never works the same way again. The strange thing about winning is how quickly the noise disappears. After the new board settled in and the compliance committee was made permanent, the neighborhood grew quieter than it had been in years. No warning letters taped to doors. No anonymous complaints forwarded through the HOA portal. No patrol cars cruising slowly at night, shining spotlights into yards like we were suspect instead of residents. People smiled again, walked their dogs longer, let their trash can sit out an extra hour without fear. From the outside, it looked like peace. From the inside, I knew better. Systems don't forget humiliation. They adapt. The new board invited me to a strategic planning session. That was a phrase they used. Friendly, forward-looking, harmless. I accepted, but not without preparation. I reviewed the agenda, noted what wasn't listed, and brought a recorder. Not because I distrusted them, but because memory is selective and minutes can be edited. The session was held in the clubhouse on a Tuesday evening. Coffee, bottled water, name placards. It felt corporate. Clean. Controlled. That was the third clue. They wanted to talk about efficiency. Efficiency is often code for consolidation. Consolidation is code for control. The board president, a well-meaning engineer named Paul, opened with optimism. We've made great progress, he said. Residents are happier. Complaints are down. I nodded. But, he continued, the compliance committee has created friction. There it was. Some homeowners feel intimidated, another board member added, like they're under investigation. I kept my voice even. The committee doesn't investigate people. It reviews processes. They exchange glances. Paul leaned forward. What if we integrated the committee into the board structure? Streamline communication. I smiled. Not outwardly, internally, because this wasn't reform. This was absorption. If the committee becomes subordinate to the board, I said, it ceases to be independent. Independent doesn't mean unaccountable, Paul replied. Correct, I said. It means insulated from pressure. Silence stretched. They hadn't expected resistance. Not now. Not after things had settled. This was a trap. Once things improve, people want stability more than justice. They start to see safeguards as obstacles, watchdogs as threats. I didn't accuse them. I didn't lecture. I asked a question. Which findings in our last report do you disagree with? No answer. Which recommendations have caused harm? Still nothing. They shifted in their seats. Paper rustled. What you're proposing, I continued gently, would undo the very trust you've built. Paul sighed. We're just trying to move forward. So am I said. Forward includes remembering how we got here. The meeting ended without resolution, but I could feel the current changing. Support was thinning, not because people thought I was wrong, but because they were tired. Fatigue is power's greatest ally. Over the next month, small changes appeared. Subtle, procedural. Meeting time shifted earlier, harder for working residents to attend. Agenda items were bundled. Language softened. Shall became may. Reporting deadlines became as practicable. None of it violated the rules. Together, it diluted them. I raised concerns. Politely, formally, they thanked me and did nothing. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. I had become the system's conscience, and consciences are tolerated only until they become inconvenient. The real test came with a zoning variance request. A developer, connected, well-funded, wanted an exception for a multi-unit renovation. It bent several architectural guidelines. Normally, it would have been denied or sent back for revision. This time, it sailed through. I requested the justification. Economic benefit, the board said. I requested the analysis. There wasn't one. The committee flagged it as non-compliant, issued a recommendation to pause approval. The board overrode it. Perfectly legal, publicly questionable. Residents noticed. Emails came in again. Not angry, worried. This feels like before. That sentence matters. I asked for a special session to discuss override thresholds. The board delayed, then postponed, then canceled. I knew what was coming before it arrived. A proposal to sunset the committee. Temporary measures. They called it emergency governance adjustments. 6 months, maybe 12. Long enough for memory to fade. I didn't fight it immediately. I waited, because systems reveal their weakest point when they think they are winning. I reviewed the bylaws again. Not the parts everyone quoted, the parts no one ever read. Amendments, transitional clauses, a section added years ago after a lawsuit no one liked to talk about. There it was, a requirement that any reduction in oversight mechanisms following a governance failure required a community referendum. Not a board vote, a referendum. The board either hadn't seen it, or hoped no one else would. I requested inclusion of the referendum requirement on the next agenda. They refused, citing interpretive disagreement. That refusal was a mistake, because disagreement triggers process. I filed a formal notice of procedural violation, copied the city liaison, the insurer, the HOA's attorney. Suddenly, everyone wanted a meeting. This one was tense. You're undermining us, Paul said, voice tight. I'm enforcing the rules, I replied. You don't even live in fear of fines anymore, another board member snapped. Why do you care so much? I paused before answering. Because systems don't abuse power all at once, I said. They test whether anyone is still watching. The room went quiet. The attorney cleared his throat. The clause does appear to apply. The board slumped. The referendum was scheduled. Ballots mailed. Information packets included. Mine and theirs. I didn't campaign. I didn't have to. People remember the sirens. The letters. The fear. The vote wasn't close. The committee stayed. The board issued a statement reaffirming transparency. And something else changed. They stopped seeing me as an obstacle. They started seeing me as infrastructure, not an enemy, a permanent part of the system. That's the final stage of control no one talks about. When power doesn't fight you anymore, because it can't function without you. The most dangerous moment isn't when power confronts you. It's when it stops acknowledging you at all. After the referendum, the board didn't argue with me anymore. They didn't push back. They didn't propose reforms that smelled like rollback. On paper, everything was aligned. Procedures followed, reports filed, meetings held. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt the ground shift. Emails stopped including me unless absolutely required. Conversations happened offline. Decisions were made quickly, efficiently, and technically within bounds. I hadn't been defeated. I'd been sidelined. That's how modern systems neutralize threats. Not with force, but with omission. If you're not in the room, you're not obstructing. If you're not obstructing, you're irrelevant. Or so they hope. The first sign came from a budget. I review numbers the way some people read novels, looking for rhythm, for tension, for what doesn't fit. The quarterly budget revision slid through with minimal discussion. Most residents skimmed it. I didn't. The compliant committee's funding line had been reduced. Not eliminated. Trimmed. Travel reimbursements gone. Software subscriptions labeled non-essential. Training funds deferred. Death by paper cuts. I requested clarification. The response was friendly, vague. We're tightening across the board. Except they weren't. The landscaping contract had increased. Legal consulting hours had doubled. A community branding initiative appeared out of nowhere. They weren't cutting costs. They were reallocating influence. I didn't accuse. I documented. Then I asked a question no one expected. Who approves budget amendments mid-cycle? The answer was buried in a resolution passed years ago by the very board that had resigned. Emergency authority. Temporary measures. Still active. Still exploitable. I filed a memo recommending repeal. The board thanked me and tabled it. So I changed tactics. If you can't stop a system from minimizing you, you make yourself indispensable again. But not visibly. You become a dependency. I reached out to the city liaison, not to complain, to coordinate. Shared anonymized data. Policy templates. Best practices. I did the same with the insurer's risk analyst. Then the police department's community relations officer. Not loudly. Not publicly. Quietly. Within weeks, the HOA was being referenced as a model for reform in emails that didn't include the board. The board started hearing about decisions secondhand. That rattles people. The next board meeting was tense. Not hostile, uneasy. Paul spoke carefully. We've noticed increased external engagement. Yes, I said, it's part of risk mitigation. We'd prefer to manage those relationships directly. I nodded. You can. The pause that followed was long. But you'd need the institutional knowledge, I added, which currently lives with the committee. That was the leverage. They didn't argue. Instead, they tried something subtler. They offered me a role, a paid advisory position, modest stipend, formal title, reporting to the board. It was framed as appreciation. It was a leash. I declined. Politely. Publicly. That's when the tone changed. Not openly, but internally. Requests took longer. Access was delayed. Documents arrived redacted. Just enough friction to slow momentum. They hoped I'd burn out. They underestimated stubbornness. I began publishing summaries. Not internal documents, public-facing reports. Clear language. No blame. Just explanations of how the system worked, what protections existed, why they mattered. People read them, shared them, started asking questions again. At the same time, a former board member filed a lawsuit. Not against me, against the HOA, wrongful removal, defamation, emotional distress. It was weak, but lawsuits aren't about strength. They're about pressure. The board panicked. Emergency session. Legal bills skyrocketed. They asked me to help. This time, I said yes. On my terms. I analyzed the complaint, identified inconsistencies, recommended a response strategy focused on documentation, not defense. It worked. The case was dismissed. Quietly. After that, they stopped trying to make me invisible. They still didn't like me. That didn't matter. What mattered was that they now understood something essential. Removing me would cost more than keeping me. The final shift came from an unexpected place. A new homeowner joined the committee. Young. Smart. Idealistic. She asked me one night, after a meeting, how did you end up in control of all this? I laughed. I'm not in control. She raised an eyebrow. I just made sure no one else could be irresponsible without consequences. That's the difference. Control is brittle. Accountability is durable. The board eventually stopped maneuvering, not because they become virtuous, but because the system no longer allowed shortcuts. I didn't need to fight anymore. The system fought itself, automatically, predictably, endlessly. That's when I knew the transformation was complete. Because true power doesn't announce itself. It embeds. And once embedded, it's very hard to remove without tearing everything down. Control, real control, isn't about holding on forever. It's about knowing when the system can survive without you. I realized it on an ordinary morning. No sirens, no emails marked urgent. Just sunlight on the kitchen counter and a neighborhood newsletter folded beside my coffee. The headline wasn't about conflict. It was about a community garden. That's when it hit me. The system was working. Not because I was watching, but because it no longer needed me to. The board meetings had changed. They ran longer now, not because of arguments, but because questions were encouraged. Committee reports weren't treated like annoyances. They were discussed, challenged, improved. Disagreement had become normal. That's a sign of a healthy structure. I'd stopped being the center weeks ago. Others spoke up. Others cited bylaws. Others asked for documentation. The language had spread. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't resign dramatically. I simply started stepping back. First, I delegated more. Then I stopped drafting reports myself and reviewed instead. Then I skipped a meeting. No one panicked. That mattered. The final test came when a minor enforcement issue surfaced, exactly the kind that used to spiral. A homeowner challenged a fine. The board asked for a recommendation. I stayed quiet. The committee handled it. By the book. Transparent. Calm. The board accepted it. I smiled. A month later, I submitted my resignation as chair. Short. Professional. No speech. They asked me to reconsider. I declined, because the point was never to rule. It was to prove the rules mattered. At the farewell gathering, casual, awkward, sincere, Paul shook my hand. I didn't understand at first, he said. I thought you were trying to take over. I replied. He stiffened. Just not the way you thought. I added. I walked home that night through a neighborhood that felt different. Not quieter, steadier, like a house after renovation. Same walls, stronger frame. Mrs. Calder had moved, so quietly. No farewell email. I wondered if she ever realized what that phone call had set in motion. Most people don't. They think power is loud, immediate, personal. They don't see the slow mechanics underneath. Here's the truth I learned. The HOA didn't lose power when I stood up at that meeting. It lost power when it called the cops, because that moment created a record, and records invite scrutiny. Scrutiny invites process. Process invites accountability. And accountability, once introduced, never fully leaves. You can change names, replace boards, rewrite policies. But once people learn they can question authority and survive, that knowledge spreads faster than fear ever did. I didn't beat the system. I taught it to behave. And that's a far more lasting victory. Now, when new homeowners move in, they get a welcome packet. Clear rules, clear rights, clear channels for appeal. They don't know my name. That's how it should be. The system doesn't depend on me. It depends on itself. And every once in a while, when I see a board member hesitate before making a decision, checking a clause, asking for input, choosing transparency, I know exactly why. Because somewhere deep in the machinery, a lesson is still turning. Power without accountability is fragile. And once you've seen that, you can never unsee it.